I'm going to turn to Ricki, who's really, clearly the expert at thinking through the process and strategy for getting somebody confirmed and hopefully for stopping that from happening. So Ricki, you've been through this with a number of nominees on both sides. Can you give us a little perspective on how you think this might play out, and what are the best tools that progressives have to challenge this nomination?
So I will say at the outset that while I think that looking at the numbers in the Senate, it's not extremely likely that the nominee can be defeated, I would absolutely withhold judgment as the process goes on. And I think that I would not reach any conclusion about the outcome in advance. I have the, I would say, unusual distinction of having worked, except for Gorsuch, which I didn't do a lot on. I was on one side or another of every Supreme Court nomination since the elevation of Rehnquist to be chief. And when Bork was nominated, I will say that we had no expectation that we were going to defeat him. We believed that he would be an extremely bad choice for the court, that he would change the court for our lifetimes, and we worked on conveying a standard for our justices that he did not reach. And I think that the way in which ultimately the Kavanaugh nomination needs to be approached is understanding what that standard is, and the fact that that Kavanaugh doesn't meet the definition. I worry a little bit about. I think in this initial period, my sense is that everyone was still scurrying to figure this out in terms of the groups that care about these issues. Justice Kennedy's announcement was a surprise and caught most, not everyone, but most people flat-footed, and the administration knows this, and that is partly why there's a rush to nominate someone so quickly. I actually think that Kavanaugh was likely already chosen at the point that Kennedy resigned, and that there was a nice show of considering people for the White House's political reasons. But I do think that over the coming days and weeks, there will be a strategy that will emerge, and I think it's possible that that strategy might ultimately defeat the nominee. And whether or not it ultimately defeats the nominee, it will, I think, help people understand why it's so important that they vote and the deeper principles that are involved in it. As I watch this roll out, I feel like up till the nomination was like the primary. The goal was how conservative could you prove you are, and Kavanaugh clearly was at the top of the list. I think anyone who is on Leonard Leo's list passed the litmus test, and that should not be forgotten. Trump didn't have to ask the questions. The questions were already asked. I think that now, and you can see this in a lot of different ways, that it's like the general election. Anyone who read Akhil Amar's op-ed in the New York Times today, in which he said that that he saw Kavanaugh like Merrick Garland I mean, what I would say to that is, Professor Amar, I know Merrick Garland, and Judge Kavanaugh is no Judge Garland. I think that one of the ways in which the administration could overplay its hand is in trying to make him seem that way. One of the things that that was pointed out last night was that of the 34 people who were the endorsers and put out by the White House, the validators, that none of them were women. Not a single one of them were women. And I don't think that it's an accident that Kavanaugh spent so much time in his remarks talking about race, because that is a clear problem with his record. In terms of, I noted, I really agree a lot with what Irwin said in the hearing. I think the hearing is going to be really important in this nomination, but we're not talking about the Ginsburg rule. And there was a great piece this morning in the Washington Post by Lori Ringham and Paul Collins that destroys the myth of the Ginsburg rule. The Ginsburg rule is about the same of a rule as the Biden rule was in terms of the way McConnell held up the Garland nomination. The reality is that Ginsburg did answer questions, and the standard is not Ginsburg. The standard here should be Kennedy. I think that one yardstick is that at minimum that Kavanaugh has to answer every question that Kennedy answered, and we can compare their answers. I also think in thinking about the nomination, in focusing on these cases, which are, I don't want to deny the critical importance of them, but I think the way in which that's being cast really creates the possibility of only two Republicans voting against the nominee, and that is Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. And I think that is something that we have to get beyond. And one of the things that Kavanaugh has written extensively about, been very clear about, and ruled very clearly about is the extensive authority of the president and the executive. And I think that right now Americans want to see a check on the president. Even a majority of Republicans want to see a check on the power of the presidency. And you've got 3 men in the Senate, and I say men because I don't think we should just pick on the women, Rand Paul, Bob Corker, Jeff Flake, who care a lot about the overreaching executive. So I think that as the strategy becomes clearer, this is got to partly be beyond Kavanaugh to what we want the court to be, what the court is supposed to be under the Constitution, and what putting Kavanaugh on the court means for the institution.
Great. Well, thank you, Ricki. And